Deanna, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Terrific. Well, maybe we can start the conversation here today by you telling listeners a little bit more about your background and your
Mhm.
journey to where you're at today.
Sure. Let's see how far back to go and how long to talk.
Yeah, no worries.
I found out when I was 26 that I had celiac disease, and that answers a lot of questions that and health issues that I had growing up, and so I went gluten free, but still had some blood sugar issues, and then kind of found, the Weston A. Price Whole Foods paleo type template that
Hmm.
really solved the rest of the issues for me. And I decided to change my career from marketing and PR into becoming a dietitian. So um, I went back to school and I now have a clinical practice where I help people largely with GI issues and blood sugar issues and weight loss in Concord, Massachusetts. And then I also have lived for the last 18 years on an organic farm that raises vegetables and pasture raised meats. And so my latest book and film project really focuses on, the role animals have in our food system. Are they healthy to eat? I shouldn't say even that I'm asking the question. I am saying they're healthy to eat. They can be a good thing for our environment when managed well, and that ethically, there really is no life without death. And so our best opportunity is to give the animals a good life and a swift and humane death. And so I really challenge the idea that a plant-based diet is the diet of least harm.
Yeah, it's such a, looking forward to diving into the topic here, obviously around animal protein, meat consumption, but as you mentioned, the connection with the environment, as we get into even, beliefs, there's so many misconceptions, preconceptions, myths, emotions around meat and animal products. Maybe let's start from an evolutionary perspective and talk about
Mhm.
longevity and the hunter-gatherer tribes around the world. When we look at those tribes, these are societies that almost exclusively, to my knowledge, included animal products, across these different pockets around the world. And so I'm just curious, in your work and research, is that something, being a Weston A. Price
Mhm.
advocate, is that something that resonated with you early on, or is that something that through your research that became more prominent?
Yeah, I mean, Rob's book, The Paleo Solution, also was a pivotal book for me in my own diet, and also just kind of looking at nutrition from an evolutionary lens. And actually, as we move into the environmental section of the book, it really is also looking at things from an evolutionary lens. How do animals move in nature, and how can we mimic that through our food production? But what we see when we look back is, you know, no processed foods, lots of roots and tubers, but also lots of animal products, and lots of animal fat, lots of animal protein, organ meat consumption. And we don't have any examples of a just gatherer society. There were hunter gatherer societies. And so we've been eating meat for the last 3.5 million years. And so it's really hard for me to see how people are blaming meat for our modern health conditions when, diabetes was just not something that was prevalent back in those days. Now, longevity was not as long, but when you factor out the infant mortality rate, I mean, we have things today like antibiotics, shelter, and hospitals to deliver babies in. So when you factor out the infant mortality rate, the folks that actually grew to adulthood made it quite long
Hmm.
without a lot of the modern chronic diseases that we see today. As soon as we started farming about 10,000 years ago, we immediately got shorter and sicker as a culture. Um, and it's just gotten progressively worse since then, especially over the last 100 years, as we've shifted now to more processed foods, more indoor work, more sedentary lifestyle, less sleep, and really, people are concerned about our health, and unfortunately, because we're uncomfortable with the idea of death, and we've really separated ourselves from agriculture, meat has become an unfair scapegoat for a lot of the blame. And the studies vilifying meat from a health perspective are really just based on these population studies that you can't actually draw a cause from. So when you look at a typical vegetarian and then a typical omnivore, like a standard American diet omnivore, the omnivore is much more likely to smoke cigarettes, to not exercise as much, to not meditate, things like that. Your typical vegetarian shops at health food stores. They eat a lot more fruits and vegetables even than a typical omnivore, of course. But when we look at omnivores and vegetarians that shop at health food stores and compare longevity between those two populations, so sort of adjusting for lifestyle factors, what we see is really no difference at all in longevity between folks who eat meat and folks who don't.
Yeah, it's interesting when we have this evolutionary rationale for animal protein consumption, looking back at the hunter-gatherer tribes around the world and throughout evolution, and then we start to see, like as you mentioned, observational studies showing association between various things, and you hear a lot of things bandied about around cancer, or as we talk here, longevity, and just as you mentioned, when we start to tease out some of these confounding factors, we don't see any difference in longevity between vegetarians and omnivores, and this is where that idea that, again, meat is going to be adverse for our health is a notion that's surprising that it's gained so much traction. And you talked a lot about, or you've mentioned here, sort of growth rates and height across generations, mm-hmm. and that's obviously something that's typically defines a healthy diet when we see these growth rates increasing from generation to generation. Can you talk a little bit about that mid-Victorian diet and that late 1800s and early 1900s when our dietary pattern shifted and some of the consequences there?
Sure. And this is really something that Rob goes off on a lot, mostly. So he's the one who wrote most of that section, but I can certainly address it. So, it's really hard to put people in a lab and just have one group eat meat and the other one eat a similar diet but without meat, and then see what happens over time. But this mid-Victorian diet is interesting because it is a natural experiment. It's in the mid-Victorian era, people had a large shift in their diet, and they ate a lot more fresh fruits and vegetables. They had a very high caloric intake. Much more food than even the typical American is eating today. But the diet had a ton of animal products as well. And their health got significantly better, and it lasted over a couple generations. And then as soon as the Industrial Revolution happened and people started eating a lot more sugar and refined carbs and things like that, the diet got worse again. And so we can see that, meat isn't necessarily the main driver in that study. It was really sugar and processed flours and things like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's interesting when we look at different populations around the world as well. And when we see rural areas, places in Africa where, children who do have less access to animal proteins, eggs, things like that, again, we see these similar reductions in things like growth rates. So obviously when we talk about the value of protein and the value of all the micronutrients and the nutrient density of animal proteins is so crucial. And if we obviously maybe come back to this topic around, red meat, if we think about how much we're consuming, Americans, Canadians, and in the UK, probably very similar consumption rates. Have we increased our intake over the last, 40 years since the 1970s, or what do the statistics tell us there?
Yeah, so there is an assumption that we're eating much more meat than ever before, but actually that's not true. So when we look at the typical American diet, once you factor in all the animal products that go into making health food and all the loss that happens when you cut away the bone, you take off the leather, and what makes it into America's kitchens is really only about 2 ounces per person per day. And so meat consumption has trended down since the 1970s, and worldwide it is it is at a flat line. What we are seeing a lot more of is chicken consumption, and that's because we've been able to produce chicken really, really cheaply and efficiently. And that's partly due to the rise in antibiotic use, and more factory farms, cheap oil, things like that. And then we see much more intake of ultra-processed foods and ultra-processed oils. And so red meat consumption, beef consumption is actually not up.
Yeah, it's fascinating in your book as well when you look at just what people are consuming at home. And, having lived in Europe and obviously being from Canada, we see the statistics, just as you mentioned in the book there, about 10% of Americans report liking to cook. And obviously these are in stark contrast when we look at a lot of the European countries where, the percentage of household spending on ultra processed food in places like France or Italy or Spain is 15 or 18%, whereas in places like Canada or the US and the UK, it's upwards of 50, percent or more. So obviously that food preparation piece and being able to cook and enjoy real food is such an important piece in this whole story. As a clinician, when you're working with clients, is this, a major roadblock that you see as well?
Yeah, so I live in a suburb of Boston where, people are highly educated and, very health conscious, and a lot of folks are also very worried about the environment, and almost nobody is eating red meat around here. And so when I get a new client, it's typically women that come to see me for weight loss. And the one thing across the board that I see in almost every single person is low protein intake, like dramatically low protein intake. Like they might eat one egg for breakfast and some handful of beans on a salad at lunchtime. And then for dinner, maybe it's some pasta, often there's no protein even with the dinner. And so when I get them to switch, and really increase their intake of meat, and especially getting some iron in them from things like red meat, their energy improves, the weight comes off because protein is so satiating that they're not hungry for those other foods anymore, and they just feel so much better.
Yeah, it's incredible how when we just think about looking at the protein intake across the board, and a lot of people are barely meeting the RDA of 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. And, we know as we increase protein, we do increase micronutrient status as well. And so it is amazing when we can start to increase that, just how many different symptoms and conditions we can begin to improve or reverse. And, if we talk about that environmental case now, you just mentioned, not a lot of people consuming red meat. I hear that more and more now, and oftentimes the environment is a big reason why. And so this is a really obviously foundational piece of the book and the movie. And so, we obviously evolved with plants and animals. And when we talk about ecosystems, it's, the more diverse, the more complex, the better. So could you talk about, when we look at the health of an ecosystem, the health and quality of the soil is so important and so tightly intertwined in that story. How do cows impact that soil?
Right. So all food has an impact on soil health. And one of the worst things we can do is plow up the land, plant a monocrop without any cover crop at all, so leaving most of the dirt exposed, and then spray it with chemicals that basically kill the fertility of the soil. But that's what's happening in the majority of industrial agriculture today. When we manage grazing animals properly, when we keep the soil covered with a layer of grass and roots, when the animals are moved frequently so they're not overgrazing but yet not undergrazing patches of grass, when it gets just the right amount of impact, what we see is improved ecosystem function, building soil health. Carbon can be sequestered in the soil, and it also increases the water holding capacity of the soil. So when it rains, the water doesn't run off; it actually gets absorbed into the soil.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a huge part of the story, isn't it? The fact that the water is actually being absorbed into the ground rather than running off, and something that, oftentimes people aren't aware of. And when we talk about cattle, the common concerns that people have, and again, people are busy with their day-to-day lives and work and maybe kids or family friends, and they're hearing these snippets from media, and that they do start to resonate around things like, you know, the land required for cattle, the water use for cattle. You know, maybe if we can start with water, can you outline
Mm-hmm.
how water is being, you know, what kind of footprint that is really
Mm-hmm.
taking up when we talk about cattle?
Yes. And so the methodology that a lot of people are using when they attribute the water footprint to cattle, how much water it takes for a kilo or a pound of beef. Unfairly, what they're doing is measuring mostly green water. So there's different types of water. There's gray water, which is wastewater. There's blue water, which is like when you look down at a map, the things that are blue,
Mm-hmm.
lakes, aquifers, and groundwater that you might have to pump up. And then there's green water, which is rain that will fall regardless of an animal is there or not. 94% of the water footprint for feedlot finished cattle and 97% of the water footprint for grass-fed cattle is green water. That's rainwater that would fall on that grass, whether or not an animal was actually chewing it. And so, they're absorbing water actually just from the grass that they're eating. Um, there's very little in the way of blue water compared to, a crop, which, some can be rain dependent, but a lot of them are heavily relying on unsustainable aquifers, like in California, where the water is just not being replenished at the right rate. It is just being sucked out of the ground. And so what we're seeing is, entire towns that don't have enough water for drinking water, but yet they're still flood irrigating the almonds. They're just pouring water on these almond trees, and most of it is getting evaporated. So nuts are one of the worst for water, and especially that precious blue water that we need. That's the kind of water that really counts when you're looking at the footprint of water with food.
Yeah, it's interesting that again, just as associations we have, you know, almonds, people tend to think of obviously plant-based and healthy, and of course they are from a nutrition standpoint. But the piece we don't think about when we think of almond milk and just the, as you mentioned, the amount of water required to grow these intensive crops. I mean, in your book, you're talking about production that's even greater than the typical meat production, and even things like rice, avocados, walnuts.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned in the book a pound of rice requires 400 gallons to produce. I mean, these are things that we don't tend to match up equally, do we, when we read things in the media, etc.
Exactly. And actually, rice emits a ton of methane too. But I don't hear like rice-free Fridays. I just hear meat-free Mondays. So,
Absolutely. And that's a good segue then to the next one, because
yeah.
emitting methane in cow farts is obviously a big topic, ironically, these days. And so, when we talk about cows emitting too many greenhouse gases, what is that, what is that true footprint there?
So again, the methodology is a little skewed and not really fair. So there's a big difference between naturally occurring sort of biogenic methane, part of a methane's carbon cycle, and then pumping up locked carbon that's been sequestered for ever, and then pumping it into the atmosphere. And that's what's happening with fossil fuels. It's a one-way street. They're extracting ancient carbon, and then they're just pumping it right up. The methane that is coming from cattle actually gets broken down into CO2 and water vapor, which is part of the water cycle. And then the CO2 is taken up by the plants. The oxygen is respirated back out, and that's what we breathe. That carbon then becomes part of the grass, part of the roots, and then the roots are also leaking little bits of carbon, which are basically sugars, to the microbes in the soil and to the fungal networks in the soil, who are then exchanging that carbon for nutrients the plant actually needs to grow. And so it's a symbiotic relationship where the fungi are going and mining rocks, breaking down all the minerals that the grass needs, and pumping it to to the grass in exchange for that carbon, which is what the fungi need. And some of that carbon actually gets sequestered in the soil when the roots die and then grow back again. And we absolutely have to have grazing animals as part of that cycle, because if the grass is not biologically broken down, what happens is it just keeps on growing and growing and then oxidizes. It just turns brown and lays down. So that's what happens when you have a field with no animals on it. After time, the grass will just die. But if we have animal impact, their chewing and pooping and peeing on the grass is actually beneficial and is required in order for healthy grasslands.
That's a part of the story that doesn't really get told very often. We just think of cattle are taking up land. These lands are being deforested, and not having animals on there would then allow the lands to just naturally replenish themselves. But just as you mentioned, this ecosystem requires these different factors, and of course, the soil and even the ability to sequester carbon into the soil requires these, this ecosystem that's been doing this for millions of years, correct?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And if on that topic around taking up too much land, we talk about cattle grazing. Is that, obviously there are areas of the world where forests are being deforested for crops. What is that when we look at the big picture in terms of land and how much land they take up and how that's playing a role in this whole story? Can you touch on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another really big problem. And I'm not definitely advocating for, cutting down the Amazon
For
and
sure.
burning it and things like that. But the majority of that soy that's being planted there is for the soy oil industry, not for animal feed. And what they're doing with cattle when they put them on the land that right after it's been burned is actually to have them graze down the rest of the plant material that didn't get burned so that they can plant soy, because they're actually making more money off the soy than they are off cattle. So when we look at the overall, agricultural land that we have on the planet, most of that land is not croppable.
Mm-hmm.
So it's either too hilly, too rocky, too brittle, too hot, too dry for us to be able to plant corn and rice and soy and wheat. And so that's really the arable land that we have available is about 1/3 of our agricultural land. The rest is really only suitable for grazing animals. So that's why in Mongolia, the populations have traditionally been herding populations. So they move with their pastoralists, they move with the cattle. You can't really plow up the land in Mongolia and turn it into cropland. And so those of us who live in America, we're used to flying over the Midwest and looking down and seeing squares
For
of,
sure. Canada.
patchwork of squares. But that's not a naturally occurring system, and that can't occur on most of the Earth's surface. Interestingly, even with the beef cattle population in the U.S., 85% of our current beef cattle are grazing on land that we can't crop.
Incredible.
Our cattle are not born on a feedlot and live their entire lives on a feedlot. Some of them are finished on a feedlot. But even when they're finished on a feedlot, lots of what they're taking in are what they call crop residue. So extra corn husks from the ethanol industry, the outer casing of peas from the pea protein industry, things like that, things that really have no other use in our food system other than feeding it to animals that can digest that and turn that into protein. So pigs can't do that. Chickens can't do that. Only ruminant animals can do that. So they're a net protein upcycler, and it really only takes about 2.5 pounds of grain per pound of meat, which is about the same as chicken. And red meat is way more nutrient dense than chicken. Chicken is very high in omega-6s, which are the inflammatory fats. Ethically too, when we're considering, animal welfare, chickens 100% of the time are living indoors, in really crowded conditions where, cattle, if they're finished on a feedlot, they're not in cages. They can still walk around, and it's just like the last about 3 months of their lives. Most of their life is actually spent on pasture.
Hmm.
But there are really good environmental and ethical reasons why 100% grass-fed animals are even better. And so, actually, in our film Sacred Cow, we visited with James Rebanks, who is a sheep farmer in northern England in Matterdale, and um, and it's just really interesting that people want rural England to stay that way.
Hmm.
They want the landscapes like that, but then they're not willing to support the farmers that are working that land, and pay for the meat that comes off that land. They're still choosing cheap meat, and that's really unfortunate. And so, farmers like James are actually improving the landscape with their farming practices.
Yeah, it's amazing the layers that you start to get to in this conversation around environment, because then we talk about government and subsidies that we give to various farmers and or the environmental groups, and where those monies are going to, whom are we supporting to be able to provide individuals like that with more of a backing to be able to support that livelihood, and help with even the cost of some of those products. Now, you mentioned chicken, which is obviously, we hear that all the time. I mean, I'm sure you hear that with clients as well. If trying to get healthier, I'm eating more chicken, less beef. When we talk about this ecosystem, and you touched on it there a minute ago, what's the role of things like fowl and chickens in this ecosystem? When we talk about the soil and ruminants, what role do chickens play?
On our farm, we do pasture raised chickens for eggs, and they live in these chicken houses. And chickens are really great at fertilizing the land as well. And they're scratching, they're pecking, they're looking for bugs, and they're pooping, which is putting nitrogen into the soil. And a lot of farmers they follow their cattle herd with their chickens, because if you watch any nature shows and you look at what's happening on the African Serengeti, for example, what you see is when the wildebeests or zebras move on, the birds come and they're picking through.
Hmm.
They're picking little worms and things like that out of the manure from the animals, and upcycling that into their own bodies. And so there is a way to raise chickens in a pasture, regenerative way.
Hmm.
It's a lot more expensive though. Like grass-fed beef is more expensive than typical beef, but pastured chicken is way more expensive than a typical chicken. In the US, I've seen chicken for like $1.99 a pound,
Hmm.
which is like ridiculously cheap. A pastured chicken, like a whole chicken, is going to be closer to like $25-$30
Wow.
for a whole chicken. And so, way back, chickens used to be a delicacy. They used to be something that people ate very rarely, because they were valued for their eggs, and we just didn't grow them a lot for meat. But now that we have cheap antibiotics and can really pack them into these chicken houses and pump them out so quickly, a modern broiler chicken only lives 5 weeks. And if you don't kill it by 5 weeks, it's going to die of a heart attack anyway, because it's just such an unnatural creature that it can't even support its own body weight.
Hmm.
So anyone can just Google like what a broiler chicken looks like. They're these big, white, fat animals that have bow legs, basically, because they just aren't even anything close to a natural animal. And so it's really unfortunate that that's what people are eating, but that's what we've been told is, low fat, boneless, skinless chicken breast is much healthier for you than, a greasy steak.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it sounds, for the health and welfare of the animal, and even when we talk about that nutrient quality, those sacrifices all across the board there. And you touched on conventional beef versus grass-fed beef. When we look at the nutrient differences between those types of meats, are there many, or is there a stark contrast between one over the other?
So when we're looking just at straight nutrients, there isn't a huge difference between grass-fed and typical beef, unfortunately. I'd love for it to be true because that would help my case for grass-fed beef in every way. But there just isn't a massive, massive difference between grass-fed and typical beef. There is some more omega-3s, but beef is not a great source of omega-3s to begin with. And so that's like saying, 2 pennies is twice as much money as 1 penny, but 2 pennies is not a lot of money, or whatever you have in England, the coins there.
Yeah, for sure.
And so really, I just encourage people to buy the best meat they can afford. If they have access to good local grass-fed beef, please support their local farmer, because we need our agriculture system to change, and that's only going to happen if people are purchasing it.
Yeah, and I guess that leads into the question around, often people will not buy, conventional beef because they think it's not as quote unquote clean, or due to things like antibiotic use. Can you speak to that? And are these legitimate concerns, or are these things that become overblown throughout, being moved around the, social media, etc.?
Antibiotic use in the livestock industry is a concern from an environmental perspective because, and from a human health perspective, from the point of view of antibiotic resistance,
Yeah.
when the antibiotics are then going through their system, they're pooping them out, and then that gets into our waterways and into the environment. But when we're looking at steak, like you would find in a grocery store, just from a typical, more of an industrial source, there's not evidence that I could find that, you're going to be eating antibiotic residue from eating that steak, or hormone residue from that. And I also did not find evidence in the peer-reviewed literature that you're more likely to get something like E. coli from typical beef versus when you eat grass-fed beef. And actually, you're far more likely to get poison from salmonella from chicken than you are from any foodborne illness that you might get from cattle.
Terrific. And, when we look at another common question, to throw a few more here at you, obviously you've heard these as well, being expensive to eat things like meat. And of course, when we do compare it even to things now, and we see, the alternative burgers, the Beyond Burger that's come out, plant-based burger, we're talking about, those processed burgers actually being far more expensive than things like, beef, steak, etc. Where does beef stack up with a lot of the common foods around the actual cost?
Yeah. So in the U.S. anyway, when I looked at the average price, I went to Walmart.com, which is a big box store here, and Beyond Burger was twice as expensive per pound as organic grass-fed beef. But what they do is they sell it in the half-pound increment, and they also put it in a bigger package, so it looks like you're getting the same, if not more, for an equal price to meat, but in reality, it's actually twice as expensive. People do complain about the price of better meats, and there's a lot of forces at play there. There's a lot of crop subsidies that are happening in the U.S., making things like corn very, very cheap to feed to livestock. And it takes longer. It takes longer to finish an animal on grass than it does to send them to a feedlot where they can be finished very quickly. And also, you need to, we're also not paying for soil destruction. We're not paying for habitat destruction. We're not paying for, burning of the Amazon. But we will pay down the road in health if we're not eating really good nutrient dense food. And so, our health is really the most important thing we have. And so, again, I always encourage people to buy the highest quality food they can possibly access.
Yeah, it's a tremendous, in your book, part 2 there, The Environmental Case for Better Meat is just a tremendous read in terms of all the nuances that you cover. And really, fascinating is the last section, the ethical case for better meat. I think this is obviously something that we don't hear nearly as much at the moment. And you have a chapter talking about is eating animals immoral? Can you
Hmm.
touch on that with listeners?
Sure. In the book, we look at, the arguments like sentience. Should we be killing something that can feel like humans, or least harm? What is a diet of least harm? And every way we're looking at it, the reality is, things die for us to live. Even in the most beautiful organic farm that's, everything's harvested by hippies and,
Sunshine, rainbows.
yeah, sunshine and rainbows and unicorns everywhere. Things are dying. Life is only possible with death. Soil is death. That's what it is. It's decomposing things.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in order to make a field for a crop to happen, you have to annihilate whatever lived there before, because, fields for cropping are not natural. And there are, areas of grasslands, but there's tons of life in a grassland. And if anyone's ever visited a conventional farm, and seen, what it's like to step onto a field of corn or soy, there's not many animals that live on those fields. And through the harvesting, with tractors and the chemical spraying, we're losing pollinators, we're losing the field mice. If we have less pollinators, then we have less birds that would eat those insects. And, with all the runoff that we're causing from having open soil, and chemicals that get run off into rivers, then we're really destroying the environment. We're poisoning fish, there's lots of animals that rely on that fish. And even trees rely on, like in areas where they're spawning salmon and the bears eat the fish, they throw the carcass on the riverbanks, and the trees actually are able to absorb those nutrients.
That's incredible.
We use a lot of, because we live near the coast here, we use a lot of fish emulsion on our fields, because it's just so nutrient dense for our plants. They love it.
Incredible. And, in researching the book and obviously doing the film as well, what were some of the things for you going around doing the filming that really, stood out or really impacted you?
Um, Honestly, how hard it is to raise money to make a film, how exhausting it is to make a film, how tiring it is, how it's just a horrible way to make money.
Yeah.
Those are all the things I'm thinking about right now.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, I was sure to think of it.
It was definitely fun to travel to places that weren't necessarily on my bucket list.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I probably would not normally go to Chihuahua, Mexico for fun.
Cool.
But it was pretty amazing to visit this ranch in Mexico that we went to. It was amazing. I mean, the Lake District in England is on lots of people's bucket list, and it was really magical to go there. We went to Belgium. We went all over the U.S. We spent a lot of time in Indiana. So it was a lot of fun. I learned a lot about being a producer and a director through this process. I'm not sure I'd ever do this again, given everything I know now, but I'm really happy I did it. And I hope people, get something out of it.
Amazing. And, to wrap things up here, and again, there's so much detail and so much nuance in the book. It's tremendous. And with, for me, clients, athletes, practitioners, people want to have a healthy planet. People want to improve their health. And there's all these conflicting things out there in terms of media, etc. And so, a really great resource for folks. But this idea of what can we do to help, improve our health, feed the world. So, what are some of the take-home messages that you share with the readers at the end of the book?
Yeah, I mean, there's things you can do for yourself, like, keeping yourself healthy, not being a burden on our system financially or our healthcare system. Don't get yourself into debt. And also just, supporting the best agriculture that you're able to support. So, buying from local farmers, maybe it's donating, maybe it's working and volunteering on a farm. Maybe if you're a graphic designer and not very handy in the field, maybe you could make a pharma website, something like that. But I think we all need to be supporting this very expensive process of fixing our food system, and we can really only do that if that's something that we feel is important. So
amazing. Well, listen, I appreciate you
yeah.
taking the time, and I look forward to seeing the film when it comes out. And where could people get more information about the book, about the film, and about yourself and your background?
Sure. Sacredcow.info is where we have all the information about the book and film, and they can also sign up for a newsletter there. My clinical practice is sustainabledish.com, and I post recipes and not as much meat-centric information there. And then I'm most active on Instagram, so you can find me at Sustainable Dish, and then the book is available where most books are sold. I know it's on Amazon, and we'd love for folks to not only buy the book, but also leave us a good review on Amazon if you could, because they actually, that really matters. So we appreciate everyone's support.
Tremendous. Well, we'll definitely include those links. And again, a massive thank you for all the time you put into the book and the film, and really, really important work. So thank you for that as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great day.